Marcus Bennett stands before Judge Raymond Caldwell in Riverside County Court, hands cuffed, wearing a wire beneath his cheap suit jacket. The judge leans forward with a cold smile, his voice dripping with contempt as he addresses Marcus using a racial slur disguised as legal terminology. The courtroom falls silent. Marcus's court-appointed attorney says nothing. The prosecutor smirks. What nobody in that courtroom knows is that this moment will destroy everything Judge Caldwell has built over 30 years, and Marcus Bennett isn't who they think he is at all. 3 months before Marcus stood in that courtroom, he sat in a briefing room at the FBI field office in downtown Riverside, a place where fluorescent lights hummed overhead and coffee that tasted like burned rubber filled foam cups that never seemed to get recycled. Marcus Bennett, special agent with the FBI's Civil Rights Division, leaned back in his chair as his supervisor, Deputy Director Patricia Lawson, a white woman in her early 50s with steel gray hair and eyes that missed nothing, slid a thick manila folder across the conference table. The folder landed with a heavy thud that seemed to echo the weight of what it contained. Patricia's expression was grim as she opened it, revealing page after page of complaints, legal briefs, appeals, and handwritten letters from desperate family members. For 15 years, these documents testified to a pattern of systematic racial bias in the courtroom of Judge Raymond Caldwell, a white man of 62 who presided over Riverside County Court like a king ruling his personal fief. The complaints came from black defendants who received harsher sentences than their white counterparts for identical crimes, from families who watched their loved ones denied bail while white defendants walked free on their own recognizance, from attorneys who witnessed racially charged comments from the bench that somehow never made it into official court transcripts. What Caldwell was protected, insulated by 30 years of political connections, campaign contributions from powerful donors, and a network of corrupt attorneys and court officials who benefited from maintaining the status quo. Patricia explained that the FBI had been investigating Judge Caldwell for 8 months, gathering evidence, building a case, but they needed more. They needed irrefutable proof that would stand up in federal court and survive the inevitable appeals and challenges from Caldwell's expensive legal team. That's where Marcus came in. The plan was both simple and terrifying in its implications. Marcus would go undercover as a defendant in Caldwell's court, appearing on a manufactured drug possession charge that the FBI had carefully constructed with the cooperation of local law enforcement. Marcus would wear recording equipment to every court appearance, capturing Caldwell's words, his rulings, his behavior. The goal was to document enough violations of constitutional rights and civil rights law to bring federal charges against Caldwell for deprivation of rights under color of law, conspiracy, and corruption. Marcus listened as Patricia outlined the operation, feeling the weight of what she was asking him to do. He had worked undercover before, infiltrating drug cartels and organized crime rings, but this was different. This time, he would be putting himself directly in the power of a racist judge who could send him to prison, who could destroy his life with a single ruling, and who would have no idea that Marcus was documenting every illegal act, every racist comment, every abuse of judicial authority. Patricia must have seen the calculation happening behind Marcus's eyes because she leaned forward and asked if he was willing to take on the assignment. Marcus thought about his younger brother, Terrell, who was serving 20 years in a state prison for a drug charge that would have gotten a white defendant probation and mandatory counseling. Terrell had stood before a judge just like Caldwell 8 years ago, a judge who looked at a young black man and saw only a criminal, a threat, something to be locked away and forgotten. Marcus became an FBI agent to fight against that kind of injustice, to protect people who couldn't protect themselves, to hold accountable those who abused their power. This case was personal in a way that made his chest tight and his hands clench into fists under the table. But he couldn't let that cloud his judgment or compromise the operation. He looked at Patricia and nodded once, a sharp movement that conveyed both acceptance and determination. Patricia's expression softened slightly, the closest thing to approval she ever showed, and she slid another file across the table. This one was thinner, but somehow more disturbing in its contents. Inside were surveillance photographs of Judge Caldwell meeting with known members of white supremacist organizations, sitting at restaurant tables with men whose faces were cataloged in FBI databases as leaders of hate groups. There were financial records showing cash payments from defense attorneys who wanted favorable rulings for their clients, bank statements revealing deposits that didn't match Caldwell's judicial salary, and evidence suggesting he had been fixing cases for over a decade. This wasn't just about racist sentencing anymore. This wasn't just a judge with personal prejudices that influenced his rulings. Raymond Caldwell was running a criminal enterprise from the bench, selling justice to the highest bidder while systematically oppressing black defendants who appeared before him. And if Caldwell realized that Marcus was an FBI agent, if the cover was blown at any point during the operation, Caldwell had the connections and resources to make Marcus disappear. Patricia's final words as Marcus left the briefing room that day echoed in his mind for weeks afterwards. She told him to be careful, to trust his training, to remember that the Bureau had his back. But she also warned him that Caldwell was dangerous, vindictive, and intelligent. One mistake, one moment of breaking character, one slip that revealed Marcus was something other than the low-level drug offender he was pretending to be, and Marcus could actually end up behind bars before the FBI could extract him. The wire he would wear could be discovered, the cover story could fall apart under scrutiny, and if Caldwell or his associates realized they were being investigated, they would respond with everything they had. Marcus walked out of that briefing room knowing he was about to put himself in more danger than any undercover operation he'd worked before, but also knowing that he was the right person for this job. He understood the system from both sides. Now, as a black man who had experienced racial profiling and discrimination, and as an FBI agent with the training and authority to fight back. He would walk into Raymond Caldwell's courtroom playing the role of a powerless defendant, but he would walk out with the evidence needed to bring down a corrupt judge and expose a network of racism and criminal conspiracy that had operated in plain sight for far too long. 6 weeks after that briefing, Marcus stood in the holding cell at Riverside County Court, wearing a wire device so sophisticated it was undetectable, even with a physical pat-down search, sewn into the lining of a cheap suit jacket that looked exactly like something a defendant with a public defender would wear. The courtroom where he would make his first appearance was on the 3rd floor of a building that had been constructed in 1973 and renovated only once since then. A structure of concrete and glass that somehow managed to feel both imposing and neglected at the same time. When the bailiff called his name and led him through the secure door into the courtroom itself, Marcus took in every detail with the trained observation skills of an FBI agent while maintaining the nervous, defeated posture of a man facing criminal charges. The courtroom was exactly what he expected from the photographs and descriptions in the case file. Dark wood paneling covered the walls, scuffed and scratched from decades of use. Rows of wooden benches served as the gallery, filled with family members, attorneys waiting for their cases to be called, and the kind of people who had nowhere else to be on a Tuesday morning. An American flag stood in the corner, its colors faded from sunlight that streamed through windows too high to see out of unless you were standing. The witness stand sat empty to the right of the judge's bench, which dominated the room from an elevated platform that literally looked down on everyone else. This was a room designed to intimidate, to remind defendants of their powerlessness, to emphasize the authority of the judge who would decide their fate. Judge Raymond Caldwell had not yet entered, so Marcus was led to the defense table where his court-appointed attorney, David Kramer, waited, with a thin file folder and an expression that suggested he had given up the legal profession years ago, but couldn't figure out what else to do with his law degree. Kramer was a white man in his early 40s, soft around the middle, wearing a suit that was expensive once, but now showed its age in frayed cuffs and a stain on the tie that he'd tried unsuccessfully to clean. He barely looked at Marcus as the bailiff removed the handcuffs, just gestured vaguely at the chair beside him and mumbled something about keeping quiet and letting him do the talking. Marcus studied Kramer for a moment, recognizing the type immediately. This was a man who started his legal career with idealistic notions about defending the innocent and protecting constitutional rights. But years of working in a system rigged against his clients had worn him down into someone who just went through the motions, collected his court-appointed fees, and tried not to think too hard about the people whose lives depended on his advocacy. The bailiff, a heavy-set white man in his 50s, named Officer Morrison, according to his name tag, called the court to order with a practiced formula about all rising for the Honorable Judge Raymond Caldwell. The judge entered through a door behind the bench, and Marcus got his first in-person look at the man he would spend the next several weeks trying to trap into revealing his true nature. Caldwell was exactly as the photograph suggested, a white man of 62 who maintained his appearance with the kind of careful attention that spoke to vanity and self-importance. His silver hair was professionally styled, swept back from a face that had probably been handsome once, before age and arrogance set into permanent lines around his mouth and eyes. He wore an expensive suit under his judicial robes, visible at the collar and cuffs, the kind of tailored clothing that costs more than most of the defendants in his courtroom made in a month. His eyes swept the courtroom with the casual contempt of someone who had absolute power and knew it, lingering on faces in the gallery before settling on the attorneys and defendants waiting for their cases to be called. Marcus watched as Caldwell processed the cases scheduled before his own, and the pattern Patricia had described in the briefing emerged with disturbing clarity. A white college student, maybe 19 or 20 years old, stood before the bench on a cocaine possession charge. Caldwell's entire demeanor softened as he addressed the young man, his voice taking on a paternal tone as he talked about bright futures and second chances. The prosecutor, a white woman in her 30s named Jennifer Walsh, recommended bail of $5,000. Caldwell agreed, adding a lecture about the dangers of drugs and the importance of making better choices. But his words were gentle, almost kind. The college student's parents, sitting in the gallery, nodded along with visible relief. Their son would be home that night, would get to continue his education, would have this charge reduced or dismissed if he completed the terms of his probation. The next case called was a black teenager, maybe 17 years old, thin and scared, wearing clothes that had been clean when he put them on, but were now rumpled from a night in holding. The charge was marijuana possession, an amount small enough to fit in a sandwich bag. Caldwell's voice changed the moment the teenager stood before him, shifting from paternal concern to harsh judgment. He questioned the teenager about his school attendance, his family situation, his future plans, each question dripping with the assumption that the answers would confirm every negative stereotype Caldwell already believed. The teenager's mother sat in the gallery, her face tight with the kind of worry that comes from knowing the system is stacked against her child, but being powerless to change it. When the public defender, a young black woman who was clearly trying her best with too many cases and too few resources, argued for reasonable bail, Caldwell interrupted her with a dismissive wave. He denied bail entirely, stating that the teenager was a flight risk and a danger to the community. The marijuana possession charge, which for the white college student would have resulted in probation at most, became grounds for detention without bail for a black teenager. The mother in the gallery made a sound, something between a sob and a gasp, and Caldwell's eyes flicked to her with irritation at the disruption. Marcus felt anger building in his chest, but kept his expression neutral, reminding himself that he was there to document this behavior, to gather evidence that would finally hold Caldwell accountable. 3 more cases played out in similar fashion before Marcus's name was called. A white man charged with assault got bail and a lecture. A black woman charged with shoplifting got no bail and a contemptuous comment about people who steal instead of work. A Latino man charged with drug dealing got bail set so high it might as well have been denied. And then the bailiff called out Marcus Bennett, and everything Marcus had trained for, everything he had prepared for, came down to this moment. He stood and walked to the defense table, feeling the weight of the wire under his jacket, feeling the eyes of everyone in the courtroom on him, feeling Caldwell's gaze assessing him with the practiced evaluation of someone who has judged thousands of defendants and placed each one into a predetermined category based on nothing more than the color of their skin. Caldwell leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled under his chin, and Marcus knew from that moment that the judge had already decided how this case would go. The arraignment should have been simple and routine. The charges would be read, Marcus would enter a plea of not guilty, bail would be set, and a trial date would be scheduled for some point months in the future. But Caldwell turned what should have been a 5-minute hearing into an interrogation, his questions designed to humiliate and demean rather than to gather relevant information about flight risk or danger to the community. He questioned Marcus about his employment history with a skepticism that suggested he didn't believe Marcus had ever held a legitimate job. He asked about family with the assumption that Marcus came from a broken home. He made comments about the neighborhood where Marcus had allegedly been arrested, using code words that everyone in the courtroom understood as racial stereotypes. David Kramer, Marcus's court-appointed attorney, offered only the most token objections, and even those were delivered in a tone that suggested he didn't expect them to be sustained. The prosecutor, Jennifer Walsh, piled on with exaggerated claims about Marcus being a flight risk based on nothing more than the address listed on his arrest report. Marcus kept his expression respectful and neutral, playing the role of a defendant who understood that arguing would only make things worse, letting the wire capture every word of this judicial misconduct. When Caldwell finally got around to addressing the question of bail, his decision was immediate and harsh. Bail was denied. Marcus would be remanded to county jail until his next court appearance, scheduled for 2 weeks later. The reasoning Caldwell gave was paper-thin, barely meeting the legal standard required for pre-trial detention, but it didn't matter because no one in that courtroom had the power or willingness to challenge him. As the bailiff stepped forward to place handcuffs back on Marcus's wrists, Caldwell leaned forward with a smile that didn't reach his eyes and delivered the line that Marcus knew would be the opening salvo in what to come. The judge said he had seen too many of Marcus's kind skip town before trial, that he couldn't trust people who showed such disrespect for the law, that maybe spending some time in jail before trial would teach Marcus about responsibility and consequences. The words were carefully chosen to avoid explicit racial slurs, but everyone in that courtroom, from the attorneys to the observers in the gallery to Marcus himself, understood exactly what Caldwell meant by your kind and people like you and that community. The wire captured everything with perfect clarity, the recording equipment transmitting to FBI receivers in a surveillance van 3 blocks away, where agents listened and documented every word. As deputies led Marcus toward the secure door that would take him back to the holding cells and eventually to the county jail, he glanced back at the courtroom one more time. Caldwell had already moved on to the next case, his attention shifting away from Marcus with the casual dismissal of someone who had just swatted an annoying insect. But in that brief moment before Marcus passed through the door, he caught Caldwell looking at him again, and the expression on Caldwell's face sent a chill down his spine. It wasn't just racism, though that was certainly there. It wasn't just contempt, though Caldwell radiated that as well. There was something else in those cold eyes, something predatory and dangerous. Caldwell looked at Marcus the way a hunter looks at prey, with the anticipation of someone who enjoys the chase and the kill. Marcus realized in that moment that Patricia's warnings hadn't been exaggerated. Judge Raymond Caldwell was more than just a corrupt judge who handed down racist sentences. He was someone who actively enjoyed exercising power over people he considered inferior, who took pleasure in the suffering he caused, who saw his courtroom as a personal kingdom where he could indulge every prejudice and vindictive impulse without consequence. And Marcus had just put himself completely in that man's power. The holding cell where they took Marcus after the arraignment was 8 feet by 10 feet. Concrete walls painted institutional beige sometime in the previous century, a metal bench bolted to one wall, and a toilet that didn't offer any privacy in the opposite corner. He shared the space with 4 other men, all black or Latino, all waiting to be transported to the county jail for processing. Nobody talked much. There wasn't anything to say. They all knew how this worked, knew they were caught in a system designed to grind them down, knew that complaining or protesting would only make things worse. Marcus used the hours of waiting to review the operation in his mind, to confirm that the wire was still functioning properly through subtle checks of the device, to prepare mentally for what he knew would be weeks of living undercover in one of the most dangerous environments imaginable. Riverside County Jail was a facility designed to hold 500 inmates, but currently housing nearly 800, with all the violence and chaos that overcrowding inevitably produced. The FBI had prepared him for the conditions he would face, but preparation was different from actually living it. By the time they finally transported Marcus and the other detainees to the jail late that afternoon, processed them through intake with fingerprints and photographs and the surrender of personal belongings, and assigned them to cell blocks, it was nearly 8 p.m. Marcus was placed in cell block D, a 2-tier unit holding 64 inmates in 32 cells. His cellmate was Travis Jackson, 25 years old, thin to the point of gaunt, with eyes that held too much knowledge of how cruel the world could be. Travis was waiting for trial on an assault charge that Marcus would learn about in the days to come, a charge that stemmed from Travis defending himself